his power, Ferdinand Marcos Sr. envisioned a Philippines fortified by a military that commanded respect across Southeast Asia. Under his administration, the armed forces of the Philippines were lavished with resources, modern equipment, and a clear mandate to defend the nation against all threats, both foreign and domestic. But as the Marcos regime crumbled in 1986, so too did the nation's commitment to its military might. The fall of Ferdinand Marcos was a watershed moment for the Philippines, signaling the end of a dictatorship and the dawn of democracy. Corazon Aquino, the housewife-turned-revolutionary icon, became the nation's new leader. With her ascent, the Philippines turned its back on the autocratic rule of the past. But in the fervor of restoring democracy, the military, once the shield of the nation, began its slow and tragic. Corazon Aquino's administration, focused on rebuilding democratic institutions and healing the wounds of martial law, saw the military not as a priority, but as a relic of the past. Budgets were slashed, modernization plans shelved, and the once proud armed forces of the Philippines began to languish. The military's decline was not just a matter of funding, it was a matter of will. Under Aquino, the government's focus shifted entirely to civilian governance. The military, seen as complicit in the abuses of the Marcos regime, was sidelined. The consequences of this neglect were profound and far-reaching. The withdrawal of U.S. support. Adding to the military's woes was the loss of a critical ally. The United States, once a steadfast supporter of the Philippine military, began to withdraw its presence from the region. In 1991, the Philippine Senate, driven by a wave of nationalist sentiment, voted to terminate the U.S. bases agreement. Subic Bay Naval Base and Clark Air Base, key pillars of the nation's defense, were handed back to the Philippine government. The void left by the American departure was immediate and painful. Without the logistical support and military aid that had flowed through these bases, the armed forces were left to fend for themselves. The government, struggling with its own internal challenges, failed to provide the necessary resources to fill this gap. As a result, the Philippines, once a formidable force in the region, found itself increasingly vulnerable. The political instability of the late 1980s and early 1990s further eroded the military's cohesion. Factions within the armed forces, frustrated by the government's neglect and driven by the political chaos of the time, launched a series of coup attempts against the Aquino administration. These rebellions, while ultimately unsuccessful, shattered the military's unity and drained whatever remaining resources the government could muster. The once proud soldiers of the armed forces found themselves caught in a cycle of internal strife, their energies diverted from defending the nation to engaging in political power struggles. The very institution that was meant to protect the Republic was now in danger of fracturing from within. Despite the bold promises of modernization, the outcome is a mixture of optimism and harsh reality. In 1995, nearly a decade after the fall of Marcos, the Philippine government made a renewed attempt to salvage its deteriorating military through the AFP Modernization Act. This ambitious plan aimed to rebuild and re-equip the armed forces, bringing it back to its former glory. But as with many government initiatives, the reality fell far short of the rhetoric. The promises of modernization were hampered by chronic underfunding and bureaucratic inefficiencies. Year after year, the military's needs were sidelined in favor of other priorities. The equipment that did arrive was often inadequate or inappropriate for the challenges at hand. The dream of a revitalized armed forces remained just that, a dream. While the Philippines struggled with its internal challenges, external threats were quietly growing. The South China Sea, with its strategic waterways and rich resources, became a focal point of regional tension. Yet, as the nation's neighbors rapidly expanded their military capabilities, the Philippines found itself ill-prepared to defend its interests. The Philippine Navy, once tasked with safeguarding these waters, now found itself outmatched and outgunned. The nation's leaders, preoccupied with domestic issues and reluctant to invest in defense, left the military to face these threats with outdated ships, insufficient personnel, and a lack of clear strategy. The Philippines, once a key player in regional security, had become a bystander in its own backyard. The consequences of neglect. Decades of neglect have left the Philippine military a shadow of its former self. The consequences of this decline are now being felt by every Filipino. The nation's ability to defend its sovereignty, to protect its people, and to assert its place in the global community has been compromised. The military, once a source of pride, is now a reminder of missed opportunities and unfulfilled promises. Today, the Philippine military is slowly trying to rebuild, but the road ahead is long and uncertain. The challenges of the past continue to cast a long shadow over the present. The decisions made by successive administrations after Marcos have left the nation vulnerable, and the cost of this neglect is measured not just in outdated equipment or lost battles, but in the erosion of national confidence and security. The story of the Philippine military's decline is a cautionary tale of what happens when a nation turns its back on its defenders. While there is hope for a brighter future, the lessons of the past must not be forgotten. The military's strength is not just in its weapons or its numbers, but in the commitment of a nation to protect its own.